Thanks for joining us on Not Boring CEs, where we don't think you should be bored to death while getting your continuing ed. Keep listening here, then hop over to notboringces.com to get all your online CE credits. All right, y'all, let's get to learning. Liz Zhou is a holistic trauma therapist based in Colorado. She's an MA LPCC. Her work draws from psychology, neurobiology, multicultural awareness, social justice, and spirituality. Trained in EMDR and transpersonal psychology, Liz helps highly sensitive people heal from the past and connect with themselves. She's spent 3 years in the therapy field and 9 years in the mental health and holistic healing fields. To learn more about her work, check out our business Instagram at liz.a. Her last name is spelled Zhou, or her private practice website, seasonsofgrowthcounseling.com. All right, let's get into it, Liz. Welcome back to Not Boring CEs. I'm here with Liz Zhou. We are going to be talking about the AAPI community and how we can better support them as clinicians. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
So can we talk about maybe some of the places that trip up particularly non-AAPI clinicians when working with AAPI clients?
Yeah, great place to start. So I'll start too by just defining AAPI, just so it's clear what population we're talking about. So for those who aren't familiar, it stands for Asian American Pacific Islander. And it's this umbrella-like term that we in the AAPI community use to really speak to community and the Asian experience. And I'll just say too, within this presentation, I'll be referring to like Asian American experience. I might say AAPI and just know it's talking about the same general identity. I also want to note that for myself as a Chinese American person, that a lot of my perspectives are going to be coming from that East Asian space. So I just want to put that out there as well, that I can't speak for an entire community or continent, but speaking to themes. So to the question, where do we tend to trip up as clinicians? I think it's good to start with noticing like what are the automatic assumptions that we have about any population. So a prompt that I like to do for myself and for others is like, when you hear the words Asian American, what do you notice? And then having a bit of a mindful experience of, oh, I noticed this image comes to mind. I noticed I have this belief or this story in my mind that, oh, they are all this, they're all that. And just noticing the thought. We don't need to believe every thought. We don't need to act on it and like make a treatment plan around it. It's just like, okay, that is a story that my brain has. And that is like a memory network that my brain has formed. So noticing our images, beliefs, even like emotions and sensations in the body when we have any encounter with difference or any encounter with a representation of another community. So any assumptions that we might have, like stereotypes or like storylines, replacing that with a bit of curiosity. So basically, it's like, okay, this is a story my mind has. Is that actually true for that person sitting in front of me? And then embodying that sense of curiosity. So I feel that as sort of like a leaning forward, like being super open to being wrong about I have, and open to learning about someone's world and what it's like to be them, and also just seeing them as a unique individual. So as much as we can like study up and do research on, oh, okay, here's what I know about these communities and these like presenting issues, like ultimately we are working with the individual in front of us. So making space.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can imagine that the majority of people who are willing to examine their assumptions and come at those with curiosity are probably a group of people who are most likely to also feel some shame for like noticing that they had those assumptions or stereotypes. And like curiosity is great there too. It would be easy to like judge yourself. And I think especially people who are really trying to make this world a more equitable place would feel a sense of shame. But if you can just get curious of like, you didn't make up your assumption there. It was fed to you. Where did this feeding come from? Was that a reliable source of information? Did you know that at the time? Like there's a lot of space to have some self-compassion if you realize like, I hate that I thought that. I hate that that was my assumption. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's such an important point about the inner work that we have to do in order to be culturally sensitive counselors. The inner work of like realizing, oh, wow, yeah, my brain did absorb that. And of course, none of us chose to grow up in a society that is so biased and inequitable and so filled with harmful stereotypes. None of us chose that. But it is each of our work to unlearn the things that
Mhm.
are, yeah.
Yeah. And shame doesn't help us unlearn that. It
Yeah.
never has. And so, but coming with curiosity gives us like a way to make good out of something that might not have been good inside us.
Yes.
Ah. So I'm thinking about stereotypes versus like cultural themes.
Mm,
Um, and I'd love to talk about some cultural themes that do impact Asian Americans, and how this shows up in their worlds.
yes. Yes. So I notice I want to like give a definition of culture here because
Go for it.
the thing where it's like, what is culture? This nebulous concept. So to really make it more concrete for people, culture can include the language that we speak, our mannerisms and our body language, the amount of physical space that we leave between us and another person when we approach them. Even how we greet someone is a reflection of culture. How we dress, the foods we eat, like festivals and holidays, those are the more obvious components. And then, sort of beneath the tip of the iceberg, there are beliefs and worldviews. Like, how does this culture conceptualize mental health? Is that even a concept in that culture? A relationship to authority, social structures and systems, how are families organized? Work ethic, sense of humor, what is considered funny? That is a reflection of culture, as well as beauty standards and definition of success. So I want to
Mhm.
put that out there, and then answer the question: what are cultural themes that Asian Americans might be navigating? And I really do think of culture as like the water that we swim in. So we're not always aware of like, yeah, I'm doing that because of my culture. Like those are not regular thoughts I have. It's more just like it's kind of in our bones. And it's sort of the energy that we feel around us and that we feel inside of us, which means that every interaction is a multicultural interaction. Like this is a multicultural interaction.
Mhm.
And for Asian Americans, there might be a bit of a friction internally between the individualism of Western American culture, this like, let's be great individuals and pull ourselves up by the bootstraps, that kind of individualism, versus the collectivism of a lot of Asian cultures. So the
Mhm.
collectivism of we are all an interconnected web. What one person does has a ripple effect on everyone else in their family system and social system. Another part of collectivism, again, this is not everyone's experience, but a common question that can be asked in Asian culture is, what will others think? In a sort of like from a place of like survival fear and needing to protect the reputation of the collective, whether it's the family collective or something else. So I just want to name that. That might be a point of internal friction and a cultural theme that Asian Americans are sort of dancing around with. Like, what right, like the sense of self and sense of community, and how
Mhm.
can all that coexist in the same internal space.
Right.
Other cultural themes might be a pressure to succeed, and a very specific definition of success where again, emphasizing safety and survival. What is a safe career path? What is the safe life plan? And something that might be seen as more alternative, just as an example, like a more creative endeavor, like becoming an artist. Maybe that's not as supported or encouraged or even seen as a possibility in Asian cultures, because
Mhm.
it's not seen as safe as becoming like a doctor or a lawyer, which has a more established path. So those are just a couple things, and I'll just
Yeah.
pause here. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious about either the like historical underpinnings or cultural movements that make that pressure for safety
Mm.
so prevalent
Mm.
in Asian American culture.
Yeah. And it opens up a whole, like all the doors to history, right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah. Gosh. Oh. I'm aware that I am, yeah, I want to not speak to, I guess, the historical stuff that I'm not as much an expert on, but I can speak
Mhm.
to sort of the intergenerational dynamics and
Yeah.
especially this thread of immigration, right? Just
Mhm.
that the term Asian American suggests a history of immigration, and
Uh-huh.
we're all immigrants in some way, but I mean like recent immigration within the last 1, 2, 3, 4 generations.
Mhm.
This sense of, oh, we are members of the Asian diaspora, like the home that my ancestors called home, the land they lived on is not the land that I'm growing up on. So there's that felt sense. Um, and I think, yeah, that thread of safety and survival is just like embedded. It is in the bones of the immigrant story, across lots of communities and cultures, not just Asian, where it truly feels like a life or death thing of like, how are we going to make it to the next day? How are we going to make sure that our family survives? How are we going to like how are we going to make it right in this country with has totally new systems, a new language to learn, having to maybe rebuild a support network from the ground up? These are the experiences that that first generation that immigrated from Asia to, you know, the States or wherever they ended up. That was the felt sense, that the energy that they were in of how do we make it, and that might have filtered down, that probably filtered down to the next generation and the next
Mhm.
generation, even as maybe their financial situations change or their level of resourcing changed, and maybe they aren't quite in that same life or death safety survival situation as the first generation. It can still be this like this nervous system response in the family of,
Mhm.
oh, like if we like, right, it can be seen as like scarcity mindset, or like we need to save a lot of money we can't spend. We always plan for emergencies. That's the only thing we plan for, right? That can be a storyline that travels across the generations.
Mhm.
Yeah. I wonder if that answers the question.
It does. It does. And I think about like I'm wondering if as within families, if it gets diluted through the generations, like if the youngest generation has less of a firm hold on that um, need for safety and security, partly because their ancestors and the generations before them have ensured it for them in some ways. Um,
Yeah. Yes. I mean that's a brilliant reflection because, right, like the circumstances in which the original coping mechanisms came to light, emerged, are not the circumstances that like the later generations are living in. So that can actually lead to confusion and messiness, where it's
mhm,
like, oh, I hear, just as an example, I hear my grandparents and my parents talking about this, and we need to think this way, and we don't take that risk because that's not safe. But it doesn't match the world that maybe the youngest generation is living in, and it can create this incongruence of, well, my mom raised me this way, but actually the world I look around in like isn't as scary and filled with danger and filled with threat as the way she raised me to believe. That mismatch, and that can cause intergenerational friction as well.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I'm thinking too about um, immigrants who come and find a job versus immigrants who come and create a job, who become entrepreneurs, because that is so much more inherently risky in so many ways. And yet there's such a rich history of immigrants coming and creating their own businesses in this country. Is
Mhm.
there a different way of looking at that risk? Like, does that entrepreneurship get reframed into like, this is how we survive as a family? Or is it seen as risky as maybe like the way I think of starting businesses, like that there's inherent risk. It maybe isn't for the risk averse person.
Mm. This is so interesting because it is for me as an entrepreneur and a business owner. It's like, oh, wow, this is the themes I've navigated as well, right? Like, what are the degrees of risk from that immigrant perspective, from that Asian cultural perspective, like different degrees of safety.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, yeah. Gosh, I mean, that's such a rich question. I'm just like pausing to think what direction to go with it. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. What's coming to mind right now is like an image of like, okay, like literally a crossroads, right? And one is a very well-paved path and everyone knows where it ends, and it ends with a great view. And it's like, yeah, that's the hiking trail that everyone goes on. And then the other one, which like, it's a little bit less trimmed and like, it's a little murky. No, they're like, is it 5 miles? Is it 10 miles? And yeah, again, in that embodied felt sense of that immigrant Asian American experience, it's like, the automatic somatic impulse is to go for that first trail, right? Oh, that's a clear path. I know I'll get there in 5 years. And then the other path that's a little more murky, it feels like somatically a little scarier.
Mhm.
And I imagine that the motivation or the curiosity about what they could find at the end of that path needs to be greater than their perceived level of risk in their nervous system for that second path to be worth it.
Mm-hmm.
Personal, emotional, mental, physical calculation for each person of like, am I at a place in my life where I can be resourced enough where that level of risk is something my nervous system can absorb and that the nervous system of my family can absorb? Because a lot of these individual, right, career
Mm-hmm.
decisions are in consultation, right, with the whole family system. We keep in mind how will this impact my ability to support my parents as they age? How will this be perceived? Will I even be supported? But
Mm-hmm.
within the family system. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm. There's so many questions. I want to make sure we get to all of our learning objectives. But I'm going to table some of the questions, and hopefully I'll be able to come back to them within some of what we're going to talk about. Um, I'm wondering about like uh, patterns in our Asian American clients that, aside from what we've talked about, like the fear piece is so interesting to me. Um, but are there some other patterns that we may see in our individual clients that are either rooted in the collective experience of their families that just might not be on our radar, and we're really missing out on providing great care if we don't ask about it or come in with some awareness?
Yeah. Yeah. I love that question. And I'm gonna respond to it with more questions,
Mhm.
questions that I want clinicians to be holding in their minds while they sit with their clients. And if they have these questions in their minds from the perspective of their clients, then that'll spontaneously generate really great questions. It'll make sense once I get to it. So
Got it.
the questions to hold in our awareness, as if we were in the shoes of our Asian American client, is the first question is, do I exist? So this comes down to sense of being seen for Asians, where often as a community we have been made invisible. We get left out of conversations, big conversations. We get left out of political spaces, legal spaces. Even in the therapy field, right? I know most of the theories I learned, clinical orientations I learned, did not seem to have been made with Asian American clients in mind, or with
Mhm.
diversity in mind in general, right? Where there's so many white male voices in our field.
Right.
So there's that, right? Of the feeling of being invisible and of not being able to take up space that might be an archetype for a lot of Asian Americans. Not for everyone, but for many. Feeling like right, like even if they look on TV or watch movies or try to buy a toy at the toy store, that they're not seeing themselves represented in that. They're seeing mostly white faces. I know as a child, one of my core memories growing up was trying to buying dolls, right? Trying to get a Barbie, but not being able to find a Barbie of my race.
Mhm.
So there's that. Do I exist? And I'm not suggesting that therapists ask their clients that. Do you think you exist? No. I'm suggesting they hold that question in their hearts and
Mhm.
try to imagine what it feels like to grow up in a world where one doesn't feel they belong, where they don't feel welcomed or seen. The second question to hold in mind is, am I safe? So again, from that Asian American perspective, there's the whole immigrant history, safety, meaning, physical safety. Do I have a roof over my head? But also just emotional safety, financial safety, even like spiritual safety. Like, do I even feel safe in my body to exist? And right. So there's that. And we can't talk about safety, of course, without acknowledging all of the Asian hate and violence of the past, the the COVID years and the post-COVID
Mhm.
years, right? Like the numbers speak for themselves of the rise in
Right.
hate crimes. So it makes total sense that a lot of Asian Americans do not feel safe in their bodies, maybe in public spaces. As well as just the history of marginalization and discrimination, and like the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Japanese internment camps, right? Those are just two of many examples.
Mhm.
That is the safety piece. So kind of that social justice lens as counselors of like, okay, having some awareness of the histories that are linked to the client's, the identities of the client in front of me. The whole therapy doesn't need to be about that unless the client is working through that. But just having that in mind. And then a
Mhm.
third question to consider is, who am I, from the Asian American perspective, and how complex that is when we think about all the stereotypes about Asian Americans, the model minority myth, which we can get into more, as well as the expectations within Asian culture itself, all of which can cloud a person's access to their true self, their sense of self. Maybe they're so busy trying to fulfill expectations, trying to stay kind of trying to stay within like the acceptable bounds of how they're allowed to exist within American society as a marginalized person, right? The question, who am I, can be actually incredibly stressful for
Mhm.
people to answer. So those would be three entry points for clinicians to start doing their inner reflection. And then they can come into the client space really with that curiosity and that like that openness and also that empathy, which every client can feel. Even if we haven't had the same life experiences, I know that I can feel when someone's heart is empathizing with mine.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about that kind of dichotomy of, do I exist and feeling invisible, and then all of a sudden with COVID, you're visible in a way that isn't safe and triggers all the fear that goes down your ancestral line. Um,
Mhm.
and how stark a difference that is from being overlooked to being looked at as if you've done something wrong when you've done nothing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it is so chilling, like how the waves, the tides of history can turn so quickly. And then we realize just how fragile like social power is, right? Where at any moment someone, right, go from being the model minority to being the disease, the thing that everyone's running away from, that thing that people are attacking. It's a very broad way to put it. It's not like it was only this and then that, but just to
Right.
illustrate, like things can change so quickly. It's like this whiplash of being invisible to hyper visible. And both of those experiences signal danger to the
Mm-hmm.
nervous. Like both of those experiences can feel really unsafe, because if we're invisible, then we're not being seen, and then our rights aren't being protected, and then we don't get to have a voice in really important conversations. If we're hyper visible, then we feel the need to hide or to not go out in public because of the fear of being attacked physically or verbally.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, you captured it. It's incredibly overwhelming
Mm-hmm.
to exist in that space. And it's not like it's something we can just take off and it's like, let me just not be Asian. Like, no, it's like, yeah, it's who we are. Yeah.
Absolutely. Can we talk some about the model minority myth and the impact of that on Asian American folks?
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like any conversation about Asian mental health isn't complete for me without talking about the model minority myth. And I wonder if it's one of those things that people have in their memory networks, like one of their implicit associations. When they hear Asian American, do they have a
Mhm.
story in their head that Asian Americans are really good at math and science? Is
Mhm.
is it a story in their head that Asian Americans are doctors and lawyers and they work really hard? Right? Or those are the main ones, right? Work ethic, smart, yeah, like yeah, accomplished, highly educated, right? Yeah. And it's so messy because on the surface, model minority myth can feel like a compliment, like, oh, right, it's a
Mhm.
very backhanded compliment, and as we know, right, because first of all, it's suggesting that all Asians are fit into this box, when that is not everyone's experience. Not everyone has the privilege to access higher education. Not everyone goes down that path. Not everyone even wants to become a doctor or lawyer. How boring would that be if everyone became a doctor and lawyer? So there's that. It's just limiting. It's an inaccurate myth. And then it's so harmful because it pits minorities against each other. Just the phrase model minorities suggests that there is a model to aspire to, and that there's a box that everyone should try to jump into to be approved, to be acceptable to the dominant culture, right? American culture. So there's that. It's divisive. It suggests that, here are those good minorities who do that and they follow the rules and they stay in line and they're quiet and they obey authority and then they're successful. That is like the really gross story attached to that. And it creates this, possibly inner conflict if someone doesn't fulfill that myth, and then external conflict, division, tension, because it's not allowing for solidarity. It's not allowing for us to say there are many different ways to be in this community. There are many, that every single way that a person can be is right. It should be acceptable. It shouldn't be like you have to do this to be considered a model minority. Yeah.
Right. And just thinking about people who just naturally suck at math, right? Like all of a sudden you haven't met the expectations of the white kids in class next to you who were going to ask you for tutoring. So then that was the only way they were looking at you as really a person to them, maybe. And now all of a sudden, like you're useless to them. So there's another layer of not fitting in when you don't fit what people are expecting of you. And you already don't fit because you're not like the same as everybody else in America, which is allegedly white. So it's like there's a default apparently, and you don't fit into it. And if you're not even like fulfilling what you're supposed to because you're Asian American by being exceptional at math and science and engineering, then what are you even doing?
Yeah. And it's so transactional, right? Like
absolutely.
utility as a human being, which is a horrible phrase, is attached to what product or service or value they can provide to another person. It's incredibly, I mean, it's very capitalistic. It just, right. It's all about like, the broken systems that we live in here.
Yeah. Where does the model minority myth come from? Like how did that get started and disseminated so thoroughly?
Oh, I actually wish that I could have a clear answer to that. I'm actually not sure, like in this moment. Yeah, it's like just so in the air that it's one of those things where up until this point I haven't like questioned like that it came. Well, of course it came from somewhere, but it's like, oh, but from where, right? So that's something I'll have to like sit with and kind of reflect on.
Yeah, because I feel like there's an assumption that I have that schooling is more rigorous in Asian countries than it is here. So I think I've got that part that I assume plays into that. And I don't even know if that's true. It's just an assumption I have. Got to get curious about it and see. But I do know that's something I feel like I grew up with in the Reagan era is like, the Asian American countries' kids are smarter than me. Like they're being taught better. They're in school for longer hours, all these things.
Oh, yeah.
They're going to surpass us economically. Watch out. Like that kind of stuff. It's a threat.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that gives me chills. Because that's the felt sense.
Yeah.
Wow, Reagan. That
Yay. Sorry for that. Sorry to bring up terrifying politics.
That can be true. That schooling can be rigorous. And I always add that caveat, like that can be. Because of course it's a whole continent. Like there are places where that's not true at all. And from my lived experiences of having family in China, it's certainly a pattern of a lot of emphasis on the value of education, on again, the story and the value being like, yeah, we have to commit to our studies in order to have other opportunities to succeed in life and eventually be able to provide for ourselves and our families. It's this whole series of mental calculations, as well as those implicit rules in a lot of Asian cultures where, again, pressure to succeed, failure is not an option. Another story is, if you don't work hard and succeed, it means you're lazy and it's bad to be lazy, right? That whole chunk is a story. Um, yeah, so there is certainly a cultural value of education in a lot of Asian communities, which can certainly serve to like re-emphasize the model minority myth within the cultures and communities themselves. So whether or not the myth came from within the cultures or from outside of the cultures as sort of a story that like the system, the man, to kind of create obedience and assimilation among marginalized populations, like I don't know at this point in time. But it's certainly, there's a lot of things that sort of end up re-emphasizing each other, both within and externally of the culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting how ideas get formed in multiple cultures, right? Because Asian American or Asian cultures, there are many different cultures within Asian culture. Combine it with like American culture of different times in history and how we land on this thing that so many people believe in. That this is an assumption that's so shared, that then ends up leaking into our clients' daily lives and making their lives harder.
Yeah. Yeah. Comes to mind from that is like the microaggressions that a lot of Asian Americans face, right? Because what starts as just as an idea, right? The idea is Asians are good at math. Starts as an idea, becomes a story in someone's head, becomes filtered into the way that they perceive someone, and then the way that they treat someone. And then maybe words start coming out of this person's mouth of like, where are you really from? Or, oh, are you good at like, right? Like the assumptions, the questions based on assumptions, very close-ended questions that are already assuming an answer instead of being curious about what the other person might say. So yes, so that can show up in people's lives as dealing with microaggressions. And there's this great analogy about microaggressions, this YouTube video about how microaggressions are like mosquito bites, where yeah, like mosquito bite is not a huge deal. It's like, okay, annoying. If you get 9 or 10 or a dozen, and then you get those every week, and then it never actually stops, then suddenly your whole body's covered in mosquito bites. It's so irritating. Something that started off as just a pesky little thing becomes a source of like rage and anger and extreme physical distress and discomfort. So I use that analogy so that people, so that we can all have an embodied experience of why a microaggression is more than just like, oh, a few words that slipped out of someone's mouth. The term micro seems to sort of softens it. It's like, it's not a big, but it is though. It's a subtle act of exclusion that can add up to be like a macro aggression. And oh, and I'm just like pausing and thinking about like, oh my God, 100 mosquito bites, right? That is painful. And then, there can be this awkward dance where maybe someone asks like, where are you from? And if my real answer to that is I'm from Michigan. I grew up in Michigan. I was born there. But then it could be followed up with, no, where are you really from? And then that starts the whole like, okay, are you asking where my parents are from? Are you asking my ethnicity? And also, what gives you a right to ask me that here and now? Often people are asking that before they've asked my name, before they've asked how you. Yeah, just in random encounters. Yeah, I know, right? Cringe. It's so cringe because there's this assumption of, oh, this person doesn't belong here. Let me figure out what box to put them in. So absorbing those types of interactions and that awkward dance of like, okay, how do I respond here? Do I just say, okay, my family's from China. Can we end the conversation now? Or is it a moment where I have the resources in me to pause and let them know how that impacted me, to educate them on why that is a question I'm not comfortable asking because of the way that they asked it. I don't usually have that level of resourcing in me on my like on my walk, like when I'm just out on the town and I have a random interaction, like I don't have that space in me. So what ends up happening instead is an interaction where I'm trying to end the microaggression encounter as quickly as possible. I leave, I flee. Like my nervous system is literally trying to flee and escape.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had to like kind of release all of that later. So that has a
Yeah.
lot of emotional and somatic labor for me to deal with that. And I know every Asian American has had an experience like that,
Mm-hmm.
something like that. Multiply that by 90 or 100, and then multiply that as, and also add that this never actually ends, really.
Right.
And then that is, again, the felt sense of kind of what it's like to be
Mm-hmm.
in a body that is marginalized and stereotyped. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm thinking about this kind of interaction too, and like, you saying like if I'm perfectly resourced, essentially, I can explain the impact of this question. But why would you owe that to them? Like this is a person who clearly hasn't done an ounce of work
Mhm.
around anti-racism, like not even a drop. If they're like, I don't care your name, I'm just curious where you belong.
Yeah.
Like why spend the emotional energy with somebody who also is setting off your this person isn't safe alarm?
Mhm.
Um, I think it's a good example of why white people need to be the ones having these conversations with other white people. Like somebody like a bystander, even just being like, hey, um, I noticed this woman just left and you asked her this question in this way. And I think
Yeah.
this might have been the impact of that. I don't want to speak for her, but
Yeah.
this is like I'm not emotionally hurt aside from just like, oh God, did you just do that? Like I don't have the same internal experience witnessing that you have experiencing that.
Mhm.
And we can't rely on the person who is being harmed to do
Mhm.
all this work. We just
Yeah.
can't. It's not fair.
Yes. Exactly. Exactly. And it's like weird to think that that's like a radical idea in some spaces. Like, because
Mhm.
to me and you, that's perfectly reasonable. That's like, of course. Why would we put the burden on the person who is being harmed to then educate the person who harmed them on why that's not
Mhm.
okay? That's so many levels of like not reasonable, like like absurd. So I'm glad you just named that because this is the, this is what like the work looks like.
Mhm.
It's almost like distributing the level of discomfort so that it's not all falling onto the shoulders of the people who are being harmed the most, the BIPOC, right? Or any other
Mhm.
marginalized community, right? And really leveraging privilege, leveraging one's comfort in the world to be able to be a voice for those who do not have the resourcing in that moment to do that level of education, because this is stuff people get paid to do DEI work for. This is
Mhm.
stuff people should be getting paid for consultation for. This is not the type of work that people should be doing unpaid on the street, just on their
Right.
random walks through the neighborhood. It's
Yeah.
that emotional labor is frankly like priceless. Yeah.
Mhm. It is. It is. And I think there might be a sense amongst a lot of white folks of like, well, like it's not my place to speak for her. Like I don't want to speak out of turn. I don't want to say the wrong thing.
Mhm.
But I personally would rather risk saying the wrong thing and have done my best
Mhm.
to help this person who I can assume maybe didn't mean to be rude. Like I can give them the benefit of the doubt in that part of the conversation and assume maybe like they just didn't know,
Yeah.
in the same way a lot of people just they're ignorant to something and they're not trying to be hurtful. But if they knew better, they would do it differently.
Yeah.
I would rather kind of be clumsy in that conversation with that person, but have potentially helped than have you in the moment feel like, well, if I don't say something, this person's going to do this to the next Asian person they say.
Right.
So yeah,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
only way this stuff stops is if we talk to the people doing the harm.
Right, right. Yeah. And that, yeah, that kind of education that calls them in, that like stay where people can stay in contact with each other. And like, and the only way that happens is, yeah, like if people are willing to hear each other, even acknowledge like hear what the intention is, but prioritize what the impact was, because obviously intention does not erase impact.
Right.
Yeah, and have those bridging conversations. And absolutely, like awkwardly done is better than not done at all.
Mhm.
Right? Like the only way that we get good at these types of things and these encounters and these uncomfortable confrontational type things is by doing it kind of awkwardly at first, and then like getting into finding our own voice and words for it. And I appreciate, hearing yeah, just that perspective of like, how can we, not put the burden on the people who are being harmed. And
Yeah.
bringing it into the counseling space, I will add to like for in the therapist seat, if there's a client coming in wanting to process a microaggression, like the therapist job is truly to first and foremost empathize, acknowledge impact, like, okay, makes sense. You're feeling angry. Oh, wow, that is awful, right? Like empathize. I just want to be careful that therapists are not trying to explain away like the intention. I don't want to hear therapists saying, well, they didn't mean it like that. Or have you considered their intention? It's like, no, do not say that to your client who is experiencing racial trauma. Do not say that. So I just want to put that out there. Like,
Right.
that you and I are having this conversation about intention, impact, and like in the counseling room, meet your client exactly where they're at.
Yes. It's
Yeah.
also not a great place to be like, well, this sounded like a really good opportunity for you to work on the like
Oh my
assertiveness
God.
skills we've been working on. Like, not the time.
Exactly. And also like that would not land well for me coming, if I had a white therapist, right? Like, no, exactly. It's like, yeah. Again,
Yeah.
that's so, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think for white folks who might not have experienced racial trauma, to just trust the experience as your client is telling you about it. Like, believe them around how it feels.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Truly, like if I could just take that, bold it, capitalize that, like just keep them. Like people of color are tired of having to explain their experiences to people, to white people, to people in general, right? So just
Yeah.
let's just believe people that their
Yeah.
experience is exactly as they say it is. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there's so many more white therapists than there are therapists of color, that a lot of our clients come to white therapists because there's not another option. They would prefer to see someone of their race in many cases, but there just isn't anybody, or they're full. And so they come to us. And if we do all the things that they feared we would do,
Mm.
they may not trust therapy anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-mm.
That is a big one. That is yeah. And like so many things to say about this that, therapy as we know it in our kind of Western field was not built originally with people of color in mind, was not built originally for a lot of bodies and a lot of identities. It was built in a really limiting way. And a lot of the theories that we learn, a lot of the diagnoses that we use or that we are, using to refer to people were not created with diverse populations in mind. So absolutely to your point, we want to be giving people therapy experiences that are personalized to their needs, that are sensitive to their cultures, sensitive to their identities, not pretending to be an expert on their worlds, but really committing to being curious and also committing to being willing to rupture and repair as well in the therapeutic relationship, because it can actually be really healing if a client feels safe enough to say, "Oh, hi, therapist. Like what you just said, like doesn't actually resonate with me. This is actually my experience." Ideally, we don't want them doing that every single session, like 5 times a session. That might be a sign we need to like attune a little better. But like if
Right.
they're every once in a while, if a client is saying, actually, I disagree with and that's not my experience. You missed me there. That is rupture and repair, and that is profoundly healing as well. To go out of contact with each other, reestablish connection, and actually deepen the connection as a result of having heard each other more fully. Yeah.
Yeah. And that requires a certain safety in the relationship. It also requires a person who has worked towards some assertiveness. Because I know, like, I have a lot of clients that in general, that my folks all have a hard time saying anything that isn't pleasing. And
Totally.
to
Mm.
especially if they really like you, they don't want to say anything that's going to make you feel like they don't like you. And
Yeah.
that's something we work on in therapy. So I think there's also just a lot of being alert and really watching for those signs that you've lost someone, or that you've said something that's not landing. And
Yes.
often you can ask and people will tell you, but it might be a big ask, especially with a new therapy client, for them to speak up on their own without any sort of check-in. So being willing to check in and be wrong as a therapist.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I mean, snaps to all of that. And yes, those check-ins, that those check-ins are the difference between a therapy space that is actually recreating the trauma that people are
Mhm.
experiencing in their daily lives and a therapy space that is providing a corrective re-experience. Um, right, where it's like in the daily world, people are not getting checked in on. They're not being asked like, how did that land for you? Does that resonate?
Mhm.
Like, did I get that wrong? Does that match? Right. So to have an attuned therapist ask that and to give that person an opportunity to use their voice, which Asian Americans, like, again, that's a theme. They don't often get to do that because of all the things we discussed.
Mhm.
That is like, whoa, that is like a spiritual breakthrough,
Mhm.
for some. I will add to, speaking of safety, a way that I like to build it from minute one of therapy is broaching identities with clients. So that first intake session, right, where we're asking them about their life history, their family history, any medications they're on, also building in a piece here really intentionally about like, what identities are important to you? What would you like me to know about you? And I even offer a few examples to folks because some people haven't really used that language before or they haven't been asked that. So I'll say like, such as like if there's something you want me to know about your gender identity, your sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, culture, religion, anything you want me to know, and leaving it super open ended. And then based
Mhm.
on how they respond, even that is information. You know, if they only
Mhm.
say, my name's Liz, and I haven't really thought, like, it's like, okay, that's where they are right now. Great. Or if they're
Mhm.
saying, oh, yeah, I'm Chinese American, I'm a second generation immigrant, my parents were there, like, it's like, okay, and that is their level of awareness and how they want me to know them just based on the first session. And then
Mhm.
what I love here is after they share about their identities, naming like, okay, I'm hearing this. And I wonder, would it be helpful for you to know about my identities as well and how that might impact our work together? And even if you want to name explicitly, like I'm aware that there are some identities we share and some that are different. And I just want to check how you feel that'll impact the work that we do. Leaving it super open-ended, we're not saying like, I won't be able to help you because we're different in this way. And it's not saying, oh, I'm totally your therapist because we're both Chinese American. Like, just because I'm Chinese American doesn't mean I'm every Chinese American person's best fit therapist. So
Mhm.
anyway, having that broaching conversation, the client then has the choice to say, "Oh yeah, I would actually like to know about like your identities," or they could say, "No, I don't need to know that." And then based on their answer, the therapist follows their lead, and then I will choose to thoughtfully disclose some identities of mine just to help the client know kind of what parts of their world I can relate to directly and what other parts I don't have direct experience in, but have curiosity and a commitment to learning about. And then we go from there. And that I find builds safety, it builds transparency into the therapeutic relationship from day one. It also acknowledges that we are not just these blank robot slates, like we're not just like a chat GPT, like right, like if we are if as therapists we are comfortable having that kind of identity broaching conversation, it really creates a space where like we can be real humans together still in our roles. Like we're
Mhm.
not friends, we're still in this professional agreement, but it's like almost this sigh of relief of like, oh, now I don't have to like wander in my mind like what if my therapist is like from my culture or not. And
Mhm.
there's the space. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that like that idea of it clearing the space, because if they feel like they're not allowed to ask you, or
Yeah.
they're not sure if that's appropriate to ask, and then
Mhm.
it's preoccupying them because they're really curious, then like that's time spent in session in their mind where they're not getting what they came for.
Right.
Um,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm.
And I know like you've talked about different stages of Asian American identity development. Can we talk some about that and what that
Mhm.
looks like for folks?
Yeah. Yeah. For sure. Yeah. So, I always want to start with a caveat. It's not going to be everyone's path. It's not everyone's
Hmm.
experience, but again, general templates to be aware of, right? That Asian Americans might start off in a space of like not really being aware of their identities in any like in any direction. Like it's just like they just are, or they just
Mhm.
exist in the water. They're just swimming in the water, right? And you that's where, you know, if you were to ask them like, how do you identify? Maybe they're just like, I'm Liz. What do you mean, right?
Mhm.
And they might start out, and then so they might start out there. That's a place they might pass through, and then there's an inevitable point. Where Asian American in that Asian American experience, they might become very aware that they're Asian and also specifically that they're not white, right? This sort of moment or series of moments or just a phase of their life where they're kind of realizing, okay, there are faces and bodies around me that people are calling white. I'm seeing a lot of this in my books and my TV shows and my textbooks I read at school, whatever. The ways that we consume culture, right?
Mhm.
Social media, right? The magazines. Okay, there's white model, and then there's maybe this sense of like, and I'm not that. I look different than that. That might be a developmental stage they pass through. And with that comes this really thorny experience of possibly internalized racism. So that can show up as it can be really subtle. It's not like someone is going around saying like I have internal racism. It's more just like it gets embedded in their memory networks where their brain starts to associate like white beauty standards as the ideal standard because that's all we see around. That's most of what we
Mhm.
see around us, unless we are very thoughtfully curating our feeds and our content, which I think a lot of people start off not knowing how to do.
Mhm.
Um, so there's that, right? The internalized racism, and that's reinforced by the external racism, right? Just blatant comments about like maybe Asian features or like the right, like Asians are this, and right, just the stories that are so limiting, so constricting of a person's sense of self. So there is that phase, and a lot of people might just be in that space for a while. For it might not even have a clear endpoint, just like having to sort of unlearn the negative associations that the big system, the big society associates between their race and like their sense of goodness as a human being. It's all
Mhm.
really gross, right? It's
Mhm.
it's
Yeah.
it's disturbing. Um, and then there might be a point developmentally where, as Asian Americans, maybe we're starting to become aware of like truly the negative impact of racism, maybe starting to put language around it, maybe starting to find communities who are bringing language to our experiences. We are starting to understand what internalized racism is. We're starting to understand what white supremacy is and how that impacts us, and even our placement within like the BIPOC community and other marginalized identities. Oh, also this is happening at the intersection of like maybe they're also exploring their sexual orientation and their
Mhm.
gender, like their socioeconomic status, right? None of this is happening in a vacuum. It's all just like
Mhm.
like one thing stacking onto the other, intense identity development. And again, this unfolds for people in a lot of ways. It might show up as having to have conversations with their families or not, because it's not safe to do so. Common conversations with their peers, create like having chosen family where they feel accepted, navigating how are they introducing themselves, what are they choosing to disclose on those work employment forms, what they're asking about like your ethnicity and race, right?
Mhm.
So there's that. And then, you know, some people might move into a phase of really wanting to challenge the internalized constructs that they have absorbed. Um, so this might look like kind of having maybe a more like activism leaning, and this can look all sorts of ways. Having more of a language around social justice and like kind of like liberation and equity, diversity, inclusion, etc. And then it can also move into a space where people are feeling more safe within their communities, within the AAPI communities, and not feeling super safe or safe at all in more white dominated spaces. So there
Mhm.
might be like a discernment process here of like who do I want to be surrounding myself by? Where am I choosing to be based on like where I am in my personal process of like my identity and also like what's going on politically in the world around me. So
Mhm.
there's that. And then eventually, again, this might not even be linear. I'm talking like it's linear, but it's not.
Mhm.
There might be a space they pass through where it's like more of an integrated awareness of like, okay, I am this and I am that. Like, I can feel safe in my community and I can feel safe in spaces where like those aspects of my community aren't present. Like, right, having more of like a fluid sense of self, maybe more integrated, where it's not like, oh, this is where I get to be Asian, this is where I like conform and I mask and right. It's more like, this is who I am, and I bring aspects of that to different spaces and interactions based on how I feel in that moment. So that is, maybe a true sense of autonomy and personal power of like, I get to choose how I show up. And if, right, and it's like, if there's an
Mhm.
interaction where this person's asking me, where am I really from? I choose whether I educate in that moment, which I usually actually don't do, or I choose whether to walk
Mhm.
away and like have my head held up high, right? Or I choose whether to walk away and like notice my freeze response and then find a space to regulate later. That can be another version of this developmental journey.
Mhm.
There's no point at which I would say, yeah, and that is the maximum highest ideal, right? It's more just wherever someone is where they are.
Mhm.
And there's like
Yeah.
no rush to get anywhere. It's where they are. Yeah.
Hmm. I love your point of like this is all going on while all the developmental experiences every adolescent or every child is experiencing, like their hormones are going. You add politics and like what's going on in the world to the whole mix. Like it's a lot more than what I experienced as a cishet white kid. Like it's just a lot more. And like my adolescence was hard enough. Like I would not want to add identity development around race, around any like sexuality, gender, any like it was hard enough. I don't know how I would have managed. I would have managed because that's what we do. But
Right.
I just want to acknowledge there's a lot of privilege in falling into what our culture in America calls default.
Mhm.
Um, there's a lot of hardness you don't have to go through when you are, white, cis, and het. Like, so just thinking about our clients and the intersections of these identities, along with all the normal, like pubescent or post-pubescent or menopausal, or just like all the wild things we go through
Right.
physically, that kind of jack us up some. It's it's a lot.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
And the
All
fact that it's not linear, how much nicer would it be if all of it was linear, right?
Yeah, would it be nice if we just take a course, 6 week
Mhm.
course, and it's just move
Yeah.
right? No, it's all yeah, it's so like that movie Everything Everywhere All at Once, which was a long
Uh-huh.
age with age. And like I find myself quoting that phrase a lot because it's true. It's like it's everything. It's all at once. And
Yeah.
it's uncomfy to say it nicely. And I and I do think, even that level of acknowledgement of like, yeah, it is a privilege to not have to engage with that. And if things I'm saying here, like to the audience, if it's like, wait, what is Liz talking about? If it's like not resonating or it's like not even making sense, like, maybe that is a reflection of like, oh, like yeah, like what a privilege it is to not have to engage in all these levels of work, which while fulfilling in some ways, and it adds like this richness to the tapestry of life, it's also exhausting, right? No
Yeah.
one signs up for this. It's sort of it's this experience of being in a body that's like inherently racialized, right? Where I notice how just often in the way that news articles write about people, where if it's, sometimes if it's like a white person, it's just sort of assumed like Jane, right? But if
Mhm.
it's like a person of any other race, it's like sort of this thing of like, the Asian woman and and it's like,
Mhm.
why is the default? Why is it if nothing is mentioned at all, it's assumed to be white? But right.
Mhm.
So again, the awkward dance.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And just thinking too about like your community where you live.
Mhm.
I lived in a community that was mostly white for a while, and we had a handful of Asian kids and a couple kids of other races and ethnicities. But there wasn't an Asian community where, there might be one Asian kid in each class.
Yeah.
They didn't have peers of their race with them, and how, versus maybe a bigger city where there is an actual community and you see people who look like you and know your culture and can support you in that identity development. Um, yeah, just the importance of having also like people older than you that you're looking up to within your race, who you can talk to about like some of this developmental stuff that's coming up for you. But it's not necessarily an adult if you're a kid, because the adults are all wrong anyway. Um,
Yes, yes,
and
yeah.
yeah, how I'm assuming that having that as a kid makes it easier when you're an adult to, I guess it maybe builds the resources so that
Mhm.
when you're an adult, you've got easier access to those. You've had a community your whole life of people like you who get it. And you don't have to explain yourself to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, community is everything.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah, a couple thoughts here. Yeah, when you mentioned kind of like, yeah, a few Asian kids, but kind of majority white, it made me think about yeah, some other another like thing that Asian Americans navigate of like being mistaken for one another. It just
Mm,
reminded me of that where it's like, and it can happen where in communities where it's really saturated with a lot of Asian Americans or not at all, where I remember growing up, like teachers would call me by a name of another Asian girl in the class. Or yeah, I mean, just that. Or
yeah.
and it's really painful because it's one of those things where it's like, oh, you thought I was her, and I don't really see you doing that with the other kids of different races, and then it happens repeatedly, and then suddenly it's like this isn't just a coincidental. It's like it's repeated, and what's happening in our collective memory networks that why do our brains
Hmm.
this is that and she's the same as her. So there's one thing, just another pain I want to acknowledge, and that might come up in the therapy room. So again, validating that for
Hmm.
folks. And then yes, community being like so integral to like just the way like what are we without community? It's so right, especially in
Yeah.
these collectivist cultures where we really do see in our a lot of our Asian cultures like we're all an interconnected web. Like who we are is an extension of who our families were. One of the first questions people Asians might ask each other when they meet a new person is like, where is your family from? Like, what's your family's name?
Hmm.
Fun fact, in the Chinese language, the way that names are structured. So in English, my name is structured Liz Zhou, first name, then last name. In Chinese, it's Zhou Liz, like it'd be Zhou and me is the way you'd say it. So everyone's last name is the first part of their name. It sounds weird. You
Right.
know what I'm
But it's
saying?
very collectivist, right? Like, I mean,
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's that. And then even within this is within my family, a lot of other families do it where the names of all the cousins of the same generation, they start with the same sound. So just as an analogy, if like all the cousins in a family are called like Mary Jane, Mary Kate, Mary Ann, that's the same for all the cousins in my Chinese family, where it's like
Mhm.
Joe N, and then the third letter is different. It's not a letter, it's a character. My point is
Mhm.
it's collectivist, right? Like we're all
Yeah.
coordinating our names with each other. And we're
Hmm.
getting, yeah. So that community piece is so key. And I think again, this is another bias I've noticed within the Western mental health field where we're often talking about self-care. And it's kind of this buzzword, self-care, self-care. And self-care is not complete for me without community care.
Hmm.
I want to just be really careful about not like us as a field not getting into an echo chamber of like, you're feeling stressed about systemic oppression, just do self-care. No. Let's anyone's literally saying that, but sometimes that does seem to be the messaging of some of the more like kind of toxic positivity
Hmm.
those voices. Yeah, where it's like, yeah, maybe we don't get all of our needs met by an individual therapy session or by venting to that one friend or by journaling to ourselves. It's like we get our needs met by being in a space where when we look around, our nervous systems can regulate with people who look like us, who breathe like us, who have a felt sense of what it's like to be in our worlds, and we don't have to explain things. Because there can be a phenomenon of kind of explaining Asian parenting to people not in Asian culture, and a lot of caveats of like, no, this it's just how it is, and like, and there's such a difference between explaining it to someone who gets it in their bones because they have lived it versus someone who's like, wait, oh, that's so different, right? And it's not bad, right? Of course, we have these bridging conversations all the time about, oh, like this is different, like, oh, your experience is different. Those are really rich conversations. But I'm
Hmm.
just saying it's really relieving to have community spaces where we can jump over, we can fast forward through the parts where we explain it all and just get to the
Right.
part where we're like feeling it together. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I will say too,
Mhm.
harm can happen within communities, as we
Right.
know. So I don't want to paint it as like, yeah, just go to your community space and everything will begin to be healed. It's like, yeah, there's also rupture and repair that happens, between generations, between peers, and that needs to be acknowledged as well if that is present
Mhm.
for that particular client. Yeah.
Yeah. When I can think about how for an Asian American client, if there has been a rupture but no repair with community, how much more of a loss that might be than for somebody whose communities like they see people like them all around them, like it's a bigger loss until they either rebuild a new community or there happens to be a repair.
Right.
And yeah, the importance of that, like the collectivist uh, ideology being in your ancestry, in your like it's just what's valued in the culture, along with we all need community. And when both of those things are taken, like both of those are ripped out, it can just be so hard. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, there can be immense grief there. Like
mhm.
that level of loss, it is like a soul loss to
Yeah.
lose this community or to never have had it in the first place.
Yeah. Just thinking about like the way therapists might respond to, you know, like a white woman who's lost her group of friends or something, like, okay, well, we can like, how can you make new friends? It'd be almost more problem solving maybe, in a way that could be really detrimental to somebody who really needs to process like this soul loss.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, Liz, thank you so much for
Yeah.
all of this. I really
Oh,
appreciate it. I'm hopeful that the therapists who are tuning in are able to implement a lot of what you've talked about so that they can take great care of their Asian American clients.
yes. Yes. Well, thank you so much for your thoughtful questions and reflections. And this was such a very soul opening conversation.
Oh, good. I love that. Thank you. I hope that broadened your clinical horizons. Head over to notboringces.com to get your CE credit. Want to have a not boring conversation with me about your clinical area of expertise? You can apply there too. If you like this conversation, leave us a 5-star review, tell a friend, and be sure to subscribe for future conversations.